"I just want to see my balance," said the little black girl in a calm voice that cut through the pompous silence of Bank of America Premium. Charles Whitman III stopped typing on his gold laptop and looked up over his designer glasses, as if he had heard the most absurd joke of the year. The 9-year-old child stood in front of the VIP counter, holding a transparent folder with documents, while dozens of millionaire clients watched her with a mixture of disbelief and malicious amusement. Her worn sneakers and simple t-shirt contrasted sharply with the $3,000 suits and designer handbags that dominated that air-conditioned environment. "Did you hear that, honey?" Charles whispered to his wife Madison, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The child wants to see the balance. She probably mistook this place for a regular bank." Discreet laughter echoed through the hall, as if it were background music to further humiliate the girl. Luana Jackson had grown up hearing that she didn't belong in places like this. That children like her should know their place. But at that moment, something in her eyes revealed a determination that did not match her 9 years of age. It was as if she carried a secret too heavy for her age. The manager, Mr. Patterson, approached her with a condescending smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sweetie, this is the premium section. Children must be accompanied by adults, and, well," he gestured vaguely toward the elegant customers. "Perhaps you're lost. The regular agency is across the street." "I'm not lost," Luana replied, placing the folder on the marble counter with a delicacy that contrasted with the rudeness around her. "My grandmother told me to come here, at this time, to this counter." Her voice didn't waver. There were no tears. Just a disturbing serenity for a child being publicly humiliated. Charles couldn't resist. He closed his laptop and approached her, like a predator sniffing out easy prey. "Your grandmother, huh? And what's her name, sweetheart? Maybe she's our cleaning lady." The comment provoked muffled laughter among those present. "Or maybe she works in the kitchen of the hospital where my wife has her plastic surgeries." Madison covered her mouth with her gloved hand, feigning horror while her eyes sparkled with malice. "Charles, be kind. The girl clearly doesn't understand where she is." But Luana didn't back down an inch. Instead, something almost imperceptible changed in her posture. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted slightly, and for the first time, a small smile touched her lips. It was the kind of smile that experienced people would immediately recognize as dangerous. "Dorothy Jackson," she said clearly, each word weighing like a stone thrown into calm waters. "That's my grandmother's name. And she told me that some people here know that name very well." The effect was immediate. Mr. Patterson blinked several times, as if trying to process something impossible. His hand hesitated over the computer keyboard. Charles raised an eyebrow, clearly not recognizing the name but picking up on the sudden change in atmosphere. "Patterson," Charles called impatiently, "type that ridiculous name in there and let's get this joke over with. I have a meeting with investors in 20 minutes. But while everyone waited with cruel amusement, no one noticed that the girl was watching every face, every reaction, as if memorizing something important. Her eyes contained an intelligence and patience that did not belong to a 9-year-old child. It was at that moment that Mr. Patterson typed the name into the system, and something extraordinary happened. His expression changed completely. He blinked, typed again, and his face lost all color. It was as if he had seen a ghost in the database. There, before all the looks of contempt, Luana remained motionless, as if guarding a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right time. And if this story of prejudice and twists and turns touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what is about to happen at this bank will prove that underestimating someone can be the biggest mistake of your life. Mr. Patterson tried to hide his shocked expression by quickly closing the computer screen. But his fingers trembled slightly as he typed random commands, trying to buy time to process what he had seen in the system. Charles, impatient with the delay, tapped his fingers on the marble counter with growing irritation. "What's the problem, Patterson?" "A simple query shouldn't take this long," Charles said, his voice laden with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly. "Unless you're making excuses for this awkward situation." Madison laughed maliciously, adjusting her pearl necklace as she watched Luana as if she were an animal in a zoo. "Honey, maybe you'd better call your grandmother. She's probably worried, not knowing where you've gotten yourself into." Her voice dripped with false maternal concern. Children have a tendency to get lost in places that aren't meant for them. Luana remained motionless, but something in her eyes changed. It was as if an old memory had been triggered. She remembered perfectly the words of her grandmother Dorothy, 3 days before she died. "Daughter, when you go to the bank, you will meet people who will try to make you feel small. Let them talk. Let them laugh. Because he who laughs last, laughs best." "My grandmother is no longer here," Luana said simply, her voice maintaining that disturbing calm. "She died last week. But she taught me that some people need to learn certain lessons the hard way." The comment caused a brief, uncomfortable silence. Charles cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable at having mocked an orphan child, but his arrogance quickly overcame any trace of human decency. "Well, I'm sorry for your loss," he said without any genuine sincerity. "But that doesn't change the fact that you shouldn't be here. This place is for people who really understand serious finance, not for," he gestured vaguely toward her, "childish games." It was at that moment that something interesting happened. Luana opened her transparent folder with deliberate movements and removed a sealed envelope, yellowed by time. In the center, in elegant handwriting, was written, "To be opened only in the presence of the senior manager of Bank of America Premium, located on 5th Avenue." Mr. Patterson gulped when he saw the envelope. There was something about the handwriting, about the old paper, that made his stomach churn. Dorothy Jackson had been a legend in the city's black community, a woman who had built a quiet empire while everyone underestimated her, just as they were doing to her granddaughter right now. "What's this?" Charles asked, trying to take the envelope from Luana's hands. She quickly pulled back, her reflexes surprisingly quick for a child. "It's not for you," she replied with a firmness that made Charles recoil as if he had been slapped. "It's for the person who really runs this bank, not the one who just pretends to." The audacity of her response made Charles red with rage. He wasn't used to being challenged by anyone, let alone a 9-year-old black child. Madison grabbed her husband's arm, realizing he was about to explode in public. "Listen here, you little," Charles began, but was interrupted by the arrival of a figure who completely changed the dynamic of the situation. The regional director, Ms. Victoria Thompson, an elegant black woman in her 50s, approached the group with firm steps. Her impeccable suit and commanding posture made even Charles instinctively straighten up in her presence. "Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "I received an automatic notification from the system about a special account inquiry. I hope all protocols are being followed properly." The relief on Patterson's face was evident. Finally, someone with real authority to deal with this impossible situation. But what he didn't expect was Luana's reaction upon seeing the director. The girl smiled, the first genuine smile since she had entered the bank. "Vicky," she said, using a familiar nickname that made the director stop abruptly. Victoria Thompson looked closely at the child, and slowly, recognition dawned in her eyes. "Luana Jackson," she whispered, as if she were seeing a ghost. "My God, you look just like Dorothy when she was a child." Charles and Madison exchanged confused glances. How on earth did this child know the regional director personally? And why did Victoria seem to be treating her with a respect they had never witnessed before? "Your grandmother told me you were coming," Victoria continued, her voice thick with emotion. "She said that when the time came, I would know exactly what to do." Luana held out the yellowed envelope to Victoria, who took it with slightly trembling hands. "She said you would understand what is written here better than anyone else." As Victoria carefully opened the envelope, Charles tried to regain control of the situation. "Victoria, surely you're not going to listen to this. This child must be confusing things, making up stories." Victoria raised a hand, silencing him immediately, something few people in Charles's life had ever managed to do. She quickly read the contents of the letter, and with each line, her expression changed from curiosity to utter amazement. "Patterson," she said without taking her eyes off the paper, "I want you to prepare the executive meeting room immediately. And call the legal department. Now." "The executive room?" Patterson stammered. "For her." Victoria finally looked up, her eyes scanning each face present before fixing on Charles and Madison with an intensity that made them instinctively recoil. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said with icy formality, "I strongly suggest you reconsider any further comments. You have just made the biggest error in judgment of your lives." Charles tried to laugh, but the sound came out forced and nervous. "Victoria, with all due respect, you're being a little dramatic. It's just a child with some fantasies." That's when Luana spoke again, her voice low but carrying a weight that made the air in the room seem heavier. "Mr. Charles, Have you heard of Jackson Holdings? The commercial property network that controls half of the commercial buildings in this city. Charles blinked, confused. Of course he knew Jackson Holdings. It was one of the most powerful and mysterious corporations in the region. No one knew for sure who was behind it, but its investments moved millions. And what does a company like that have to do with you? He asked dismissively, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. Luana smiled again, and this time there was something almost predatory about that smile, an expression that should not exist on the face of a 9-year-old. Everything, she replied simply. Because, Mr. Charles, the lady you've just been mocking and insulting for the last 15 minutes wasn't just my grandmother. Dorothy Jackson was the founder and sole owner of everything the Jackson name represents in this city. The silence that followed was so absolute that the hum of the air conditioner seemed deafening. Charles felt the blood drain from his face. Madison dropped her designer handbag on the floor, and Patterson seemed to be having difficulty breathing. Every act of contempt, every cruel laugh, every prejudiced comment of the last few minutes began to solidify in their minds as evidence of their own monumental stupidity. But anyone watching Luana closely would notice that she was not surprised by their reactions. It was as if she were following a carefully rehearsed script, each movement calculated to maximize the impact of what was to come. Victoria Thompson guided Luana to the executive meeting room, leaving behind a completely stunned Charles and a Madison who was nervously whispering on her cell phone, trying to find out any information about Jackson Holdings. Patterson followed behind like a ghost, still processing the fact that he had almost expelled the heiress of one of the city's largest real estate empires. "Luana dear," Victoria said, closing the armored glass door, "your grandmother prepared me for this moment for months. She knew that when you came here, it wouldn't just be to check your balance." Her voice carried a mixture of affection and admiration. "Dorothy always said you had something special, an intelligence that few would recognize." The girl sat down in the leather chair that seemed to swallow her, but her eyes remained alert and calculating. "Grandma taught me that sometimes people need to be confronted with the truth in a way they'll never forget," she said, removing a small digital recorder from her briefcase. "And she told me you would help me with the legal part of all this." Outside the room, Charles paced back and forth like a caged animal. His business mind tried to process the implications of publicly insulting the heiress of one of the most influential corporations in the region. "Madison, you don't understand," he muttered to his wife. "If Jackson Holdings decides to sue us or cut our contracts." "Calm down, honey," Madison tried to reassure him, but her own nervousness was evident. "She's just a child. Surely they'll understand that it was a misunderstanding." Charles stopped abruptly. "Misunderstanding? I called her grandmother a cleaning lady. I publicly mocked a black child." He ran his hands through his perfectly combed hair. "My God, if this leaks to the media." Meanwhile, inside the room, Victoria opened a confidential file on her computer. Her grandmother left very specific instructions on how to proceed when this day came, she explained to Luana. She meticulously documented every case of discrimination she witnessed or suffered at this bank over decades. Every racist comment, every instance of preferential treatment denied, every humiliation disguised as standard procedure. Luana nodded gravely, as if she already knew all this. "She showed me some of the recordings she made," she said simply. "And she taught me how to use a cell phone to record without anyone noticing." She discreetly lifted her phone from the table. "Like I did today with everything that happened outside." Victoria smiled with a mixture of pride and amazement. "Dorothy raised you well. But there's more," she continued, opening a physical folder. "Your grandmother wasn't just the owner of Jackson Holdings. She was a silent minority shareholder in several other companies, including," Victoria paused dramatically, "Whitman Enterprises." Luana's eyes lit up for the first time since she had entered the bank. "So Mr. Charles has been working indirectly for your family for years without knowing it," Victoria finished. "And with the changes to the will we filed last week, you now have enough voting power to influence important decisions in his company." Outside, Charles had managed to calm down slightly and decided that the best strategy would be charm and diplomacy. "I'm going in there to apologize," he announced to Madison. "I'll explain that it was a misunderstanding, maybe offer a donation to a charity." He adjusted his tie. "Kids are easy to impress. A few nice words and maybe an expensive gift will fix this." But when Charles knocked on the conference room door and entered with his most rehearsed smile, he found a scene he hadn't expected. Luana was sitting at the head of the table, with Victoria at her side and a pile of documents scattered between them. She didn't look like a lost child being comforted. She looked like a CEO in a business meeting. "Mr. Charles," Luana said with an icy politeness that didn't match her 9 years, "I'm glad you decided to join us. Ms. Victoria was just explaining to me my position as a shareholder in your company." Charles felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. "Shareholder," he repeated, his voice coming out higher than normal. 5% of the common stock, Victoria confirmed, consulting the documents. "Enough to request audits, question management decisions, and in certain circumstances, influence significant changes in the company's leadership." The blood drained completely from Charles's face. 5% didn't seem like much, but he knew that in companies with a dispersed shareholding structure, a well-positioned minority could wreak enormous havoc. "Listen, I'd like to apologize for the earlier misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Luana interrupted, her voice maintaining that disturbing calm. "Mr. Charles, you called my deceased grandmother a cleaning lady, suggested that I was lost, and laughed at my presence here." She paused. "That was not a misunderstanding. It was racism." Charles opened and closed his mouth several times, like a fish out of water. All his experience in meeting rooms, all his negotiating skills, simply evaporated in the face of the accusatory serenity of a 9-year-old who clearly would not accept empty apologies. "And the most interesting thing," Luana continued, playing with the digital recorder on the table, "is that everything was recorded. Every word, every laugh, every comment." Her eyes met his with an intensity that made him involuntarily recoil. "Grandma always said that people reveal who they really are when they think there will be no consequences." Victoria leaned forward. "Mr. Whitman, would you like to hear some of your statements from today? I'm sure they will be very interesting to your company's board, your investors, and perhaps some media outlets specializing in corporate behavior." It was at that moment that Charles realized he was not dealing with a traumatized child who could be easily appeased. He was facing someone who had been trained, prepared, and equipped for this very moment. Every move Luana had made since the moment she entered the bank had been calculated to expose exactly the kind of person he was. And worst of all, he had fallen into the trap perfectly, providing all the evidence necessary for his own destruction. The door to the room opened once again, and this time a man in an impeccable suit carrying a leather briefcase entered. "Sorry for the delay," he said, addressing Luana directly. "I'm Marcus Henderson, the Jackson family's lawyer. I came as soon as I received the call from Mrs. Victoria." Charles watched in horror as the pieces fell into place. There was nothing spontaneous about this meeting. Luana hadn't just shown up at the bank for an innocent consultation. She had orchestrated the whole situation with military precision, using her own appearance as a vulnerable child as a weapon to expose the prejudice she knew she would encounter. And now, sitting in that room surrounded by lawyers, bank executives, and a 9-year-old girl who clearly had more power than he had ever imagined, Charles finally understood the extent of the mistake he had made. But what he didn't yet know was that all this drama had been just the first act of something much bigger that Luana and her late grandmother had meticulously planned. A lesson he would never forget about underestimating people whom society teaches us to ignore. Marcus Henderson opened his leather briefcase and took out a stack of printed documents, methodically spreading them out on the conference table. Charles watched each movement with growing horror, as if he were watching his own execution being prepared before his eyes. "Mr. Whitman," Marcus began with the clinical precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months, "would you like to review some of your public statements from today? I have the complete transcript here, courtesy of the digital recording Ms. Luana made." He held up the small device the girl had left strategically visible throughout the conversation. That's illegal," Charles stammered, his business composure finally crumbling. "You can't record private conversations without consent." Victoria smiled coldly. "Mr. Whitman, this is a public commercial establishment. There is no legal expectation of privacy here." She paused to give weight to her words. "And considering that your statements constitute clear and documented racial discrimination, we have not only the right, but the legal obligation to preserve this evidence." Luana remained seated calmly, watching Charles like a scientist studying a chemical reaction. There was no malice in her eyes, just the cold satisfaction of someone who sees a meticulously executed plan reaching its planned climax. "Let's go to your own words," Marcus continued, consulting the transcript. "The child wants to see the balance. She probably mistook this place for a regular agency." "Then, your grandmother, is it?" Maybe she's our cleaning lady. And my personal favorite, who knows, maybe she works in the kitchen of the hospital where my wife has her plastic surgeries. Each quoted sentence made Charles shrink further in his chair, as if the words were physical blows. Madison, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke in a trembling voice. We didn't know who she was. It was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. Luana spoke for the first time in several minutes, her voice maintaining that disturbing calm. Ms. Madison, you didn't know me, that's true. But you knew I was a 9-year-old child. That should have been enough to treat me with basic respect. Marcus turned a page in his documents. Interesting that you mention not knowing who she was. Because here I have evidence that you knew exactly what you were doing. He slid a photo across the table, a screenshot from Madison's Instagram from 3 weeks earlier. In the image, Madison appeared at a charity event with the caption, "Loved learning about Jackson Holdings' social projects today. It's inspiring to see how a company can transform communities." The photo had been taken at Luana's company headquarters, with the logo clearly visible in the background. Charles examined the photo with eyes wide with horror. Madison, you knew about Jackson Holdings? I didn't connect, Madison stammered, but even she realized how pathetic the excuse sounded. But there's more, Marcus continued relentlessly. He pulled out a second document. Email correspondence between Mr. Whitman and Jackson Holdings from the last 6 months, negotiating consulting contracts that represent 40% of your company's annual revenue. Victoria leaned forward. Mr. Whitman, would you like to explain how you can claim to be unaware of a company that is responsible for almost half of your revenue? It was then that the final reality hit Charles like a speeding train. He hadn't just insulted a random child. He had systematically humiliated the heir to the company that kept his own business financially viable. Every contract, every payment he had received in recent months had come indirectly from a family he had just attacked with recorded racist comments. Luana, Victoria addressed the girl with genuine respect. Would you like to share the decision you have made regarding the Whitman Enterprises contracts? The girl nodded and spoke with the same calm she had maintained throughout the ordeal. Mr. Charles, after carefully reviewing the terms of the existing contracts and consulting with my legal advisors, I have decided to exercise the termination clause for just cause that was included in all signed agreements. Charles felt the blood drain completely from his face. Just cause? What just cause? Marcus consulted another document. Racial discrimination documented by a company representative during business interactions. Clause 15.3 specifies that discriminatory behavior constitutes a material breach of the agreement, resulting in immediate termination and forfeiture of all outstanding payments. This will destroy me financially, Charles whispered, his hands trembling as he mentally calculated the implications. Without the Jackson Holdings contracts, his company would be unable to honor payroll or existing bank loans. You should have thought about that before deciding that my skin color determined my worth, Luana replied simply. There was no cruelty in her voice, just the cold application of logical consequences for consciously made choices. Madison burst into tears. Please, she's just a child. Surely you can resolve this in a more civilized manner. Victoria smiled wryly. More civilized than the way you treated this just a child for the last 20 minutes? She gestured to the transcript. Mrs. Madison, civility is a concept that should have been applied before, not after being confronted with the consequences. Luana rose from her chair, her small stature contrasting with the authority that emanated from her presence. Mr. Charles, Ms. Madison, you have taught me a valuable lesson today. You have shown me exactly the kind of people that exist in the world, those who judge a person's worth by the color of their skin or the appearance of their clothes. She walked over to the window overlooking the city. But you have also given me something more valuable than any amount of money. Absolute proof that my grandmother was right when she said that racism is not always obvious. Sometimes it dresses in expensive suits and speaks politely, but it is still racism. Charles tried one last desperate gambit. Luana, I can change. I can learn. Please give me a second chance. The girl slowly turned to face him. Mr. Charles, you've had 9 years to learn that children deserve respect. You've had decades to learn that people shouldn't be judged by the color of their skin. How many more second chances do you need to become a decent person? The ensuing silence was broken only by the sound of Charles's phone ringing incessantly, probably news of the termination of contracts already circulating in the business world. He didn't even bother to answer it. Marcus closed his briefcase with a final, definitive click. Today's documentation will be filed in our permanent legal records. Any attempt at retaliation will result in further legal action. As Luana prepared to leave the room, she paused at the door and turned around one last time. Not for gloating, not for additional cruelty, but for a final lesson that would echo forever in the memory of those who had underestimated her. "You wanted to teach me my place," she said with a wisdom that transcended her 9 years. "Mission accomplished. My place is exactly where my grandmother always said it would be, at the top, building a better world for other children who will one day walk into places like this and be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving behind two people who finally understood that they had just witnessed not only their own destruction, but the birth of a force of justice that they would never be able to understand or control. But what neither Charles nor Madison could have imagined was that this public humiliation was only the first movement in a symphony of consequences that Luana and her late grandmother had orchestrated, a lesson about the true cost of prejudice that would echo far beyond those cold marble walls.